Okay, we're now recording. Yeah, and I'll put it up in a few days up on YouTube in case anybody wants to see it again, or those people who couldn't make it want to see it if they do. Okay, 7 people. Okay. Yeah. So.
So you had a physical meeting in Seattle last week?
Yeah, a week or 2 weeks ago. Yeah, it was. We were there. I was there. I go back usually once a year around late September, and meet up with the old crew that was there where we started sometimes. Yeah, we did. In fact, we ended up talking about this topic, which is ahead of. There was the meeting didn't actually have a official topic, but we ended up talking a lot about this one. So let's see. Yeah. Yeah, but as I said earlier, there are more people signed up for this topic than any topic that I've ever done, really, that I can remember ever doing. There's that. There's another interesting thing that's unusual about this one is the male-female ratio. It's overwhelmingly philosophy is usually men who show up. It's always been that way. But we actually have a reverse situation. We have 19 female people who signed up, and fewer than, I think, around 13 or so, 14 males, which makes you wonder what is it about the topic that makes it of special interest to women. We'll see. Maybe, hopefully, they'll speak up and tell us, or maybe an openness to talk about it, perhaps, is what it's all about. Perhaps there's a reluctance on the part of men to even discuss it because maybe it's somehow less manly to be talking about your suffering or something like that. Maybe that's what it's about. But anyway, it is interesting. That's another thing that's unusual about this. But yeah, it's as we'll see, it's a fascinating topic because, as Metzinger points out, it hasn't gotten a lot of attention from philosophers of mind or even neuroscience. Or what has gotten lots of attention is pain. But pain, we're going to make a distinction between pain and suffering, and pain is a little bit more easier to measure because it has physiological, behavioral markers in a way that the way we're going to define it, where suffering may have those, but it's not. It's more of a concept than it is an actual observational phenomenon. And anyway, what the difference is, or what the distinction between the two is, we're going to be talking about as well. So let's see, what time is it? It's 3:06. Okay, I think there's enough people now that we should get started. Okay, so we're recording, and there's 10 people here. That's, if we get 15, that's what we normally get. About half of the number of people who say they're going to sign up actually show up. All right, so again, welcome everybody for being here, for expressing an interest in this topic. As I mentioned to those people already here, this is actually, for some reason, this topic has gotten more people interested than any other topic that I can remember doing, which is curious because it's kind of a downbeat topic, and we're not doing anything like self-help or therapy. If we're not, I don't think there's anything that we're going to learn today that's going to help someone who's trying to cope with pain or suffering. Maybe some people will find something in it that's consoling, but it's actually pretty bleak by the time we get to the end of it. So hopefully you're not expecting therapy from anything we talk about today. So I'm just warning people. This is, for the new people, this is a philosophy group. So we're primarily interested in concepts, ideas that often undergird other areas like science, for example, or just our everyday understandings of the world, about ethics, how we live and experience the world, all those fundamental questions which are not specifically the objects of study of other fields of inquiry, though they often impact them, as we'll see today. So anyway, there's that. And I think, let's see, where's the, here it is. Yeah. Okay, so the topic today is, it's about two things, but a lot of things spin off from those two things: suffering and consciousness. What's the relationship between them? And it turns out, at least according to some researchers and theoreticians about consciousness, that they're closely related, maybe even interdefined, meaning that at least one kind of consciousness that we're going to be talking about is not possible without suffering. And it's because we suffer that this kind of consciousness exists. That's how closely connected they are. So there's that. It's going to also touch on things like biases we have that blind us from seeing certain things that are right in front of our eyes. And it has a lot to do with evolutionary developments. And it will have effects, it will have definitely have an impact on how we think about AI and machine ethics, which is a burgeoning field these days, as well as animal ethics. And we're going to eventually conclude with a thought experiment that was put forth by Thomas Metzinger, a German philosopher of mind, who's very big these days at the forefront of consciousness research. That's kind of disturbing, and it does involve suffering and consciousness and artificial intelligence. And let's see, there's a bunch of other questions which we'll get to when we get to them, because they're spin-offs from just discussing these topics. So one of the first things the way I usually proceed is I want to sort of lecture a little bit here to get at first you're just defining certain terms and words or vocabulary we're going to be using, the way we're going to be using it here, and then maybe offer an opportunity for people to ask questions about that, because this is all discussion. Nothing about this is actually set in stone. The way we use the terms we're using right now is not like necessarily obvious or settled in either science or philosophy. So there's room for disagreement about a lot of this stuff, but we can talk about that. And then after have a small discussion about that, then I'll go into talking about Thomas Metzinger's theory and about both the origin and the interconnection between consciousness and suffering, and the more specific criteria he offers for deciding when any kind of entity is suffering. Like, what is suffering, for example? That's a very philosophical type question. Like, what do we mean by these terms? And why is it important? Why is it important to have some theoretical understanding about what suffering is? Not just, we all know what the experience of it is, but what is it exactly? That's the philosophical question. And then we'll be discussing this thought experiment that Metzinger came up with, which has some which seems to be based on pretty solid premises, but it has a very disturbing conclusion, and it's very much worth discussing because it raises a bunch of questions that are fascinating in themselves, such as, for example, is suffering really bad? Second, well, when we talk about intelligence, whether it's human, animal, or artificial, does that imply rationality, or can you have unintelligent, irrational intelligence? Is it automatic that if you're talking about something that's intelligent, does it have to be rational? Or can those two ideas be separated? And after you see this thought experiment, you may see the motivation for asking that question, because that's one of the ways out of the dilemma. But that's getting ahead right now. So for now, I want to start by talking about trying to define certain terms, the way they're going to be used in this discussion. Two of them have to do with two types of consciousness and two types of what the generic term that they use in this field is a negatively valenced experience. It covers both pain and suffering. Anything that you disvalue, or you can have positive negatively valenced experiences too. That would be the opposite, pleasure and happiness. But to valence something is to give it a value. It's like if it's a negatively valenced, it's bad, in short. Both pain and suffering are negatively valenced experiences or phenomena that certain kinds of beings we recognize can experience, beginning with ourselves, and to a great degree, most living things. Even how far down is a matter of controversy, but certainly higher animals do. And one could argue, because we're speaking in abstract terms when we say negatively valenced, that would include any kind of behavior that you witness or see, even in plants. Plants obviously interact with their environment. Their leaves grow toward the sun, the roots grow toward water and nutrients. They're not indifferent about their situation. If you were indifferent, utterly indifferent, like say a stone, or as far as we can tell, there are philosophers, panpsychists, who think that maybe not even a stone is really lacking in consciousness. But we'll leave that for another day because it's a discussion in itself. But sticking with very conventional understandings of certainly all living things seem capable of having both positive and negatively valenced experiences. Which in short just means they're not indifferent to their environment. There are some states of their environment that they are attracted to, gravitate toward, and others that they're repelled by and want to get away from. And so that covers both pain and suffering. But what's the difference between that sensitivity to one's environment is sometimes called access consciousness. It means that you have access to information about your environment, you're aware of it, and you are able and are compelled to react to it. So it's a kind of consciousness, a low-level form of consciousness that is shared certainly by all living things. But that's not the kind of consciousness that we're going to be talking about mainly today. We're going to be talking about the next level, or reflective consciousness. And this is what Metzinger's theory is about. And this requires a lot more than having a mere nervous system or some kind of system that allows you to react to your environment. We'll get into the details of it, but it's roughly the idea that you have a sense of yourself, of spanning time, that you were around yesterday or at some point in the past and will be around tomorrow, and have a sense of identity, that you are not equivalent with the objects around you. You're not just a process. You have what Metzinger calls a self-model, a sense of like you are a thing and you're interacting with other things in the world. This is, and further, in the higher reaches of this, the ability to reflect or look at yourself as being, you are this thing here and there's other things around you that are not equivalent with you, and they're distinct from you. Having that level of self-awareness is what reflective consciousness is. And this kind of consciousness, reflective consciousness, is associated with what we're going to call suffering, which is pain, but with awareness on top of pain. One could be in pain or react as though one is having a negatively valenced experience without necessarily even being having consciousness or of the reflective kind evident. Suffering and reflective consciousness go together the way pain and access consciousness go together. One is a higher level of it, that seems higher level, it's more sophisticated form of consciousness, and that goes together with a more sophisticated form of negatively valenced experience. So these are basic. We're going to be focusing mainly in this discussion on reflective consciousness and suffering, not so much on pain and access consciousness. Mainly because, not that they're all things that can suffer and reflect reflectively, or reflectively aware, are certainly possess the other kind of consciousness. In other words, you can't be reflectively conscious unless you also have access consciousness. You can't really suffer unless you also know what pain is. But the reverse isn't true. We can conceive of beings or entities that have pain and access consciousness without suffering, or reflective consciousness. This is a distinction that comes from not just Metzinger, but from other philosophers of mind and neuroscientists and others in this interested in this field. Okay. Okay. Now, before I go any further, though, and get into the details of Metzinger's theory, or anybody have any questions or thoughts or comments about what I've said so far? Okay. No. Also, for the new people, you can raise your hand on using the little hand thing if you want, but you don't have to, unless there's a lot of people wanting to speak at the same time. You can just speak up, as far as I'm concerned, unless there are a lot of people who want to talk at the same time. So don't, if you have a question or want to interrupt with a comment, just go ahead and speak up, unless there's a lot of people doing that, in which case we'll have to be more formal about it. Okay, so now I'm gonna try to explain Metzinger's what his program is, what's he trying to do, and what it has to do with suffering and consciousness. First of all, Metzinger has for a long time been at sort of the forefront of consciousness research. He has a theory of what consciousness is. It's just a theory, one among others. There are quite a few competing theories out there. I think Metzinger's is one of the more interesting ones, but by no means saying that I think that he's absolutely right about any of this, but I think it's fascinating. There's a lot of interesting stuff there that I find somehow more interesting and intriguing than some of the other competitor theories out there. So basically it's this. He gives, first of all, what is the relationship between suffering and consciousness? That's very much at the heart of his view. And the kind of consciousness we're talking about, or we're going to be focusing on, is, again, reflective consciousness and suffering. Okay. Metzinger puts forth some conditions that he thinks have to be met before you can say that something is really suffering.
Für Training Kapitel 9.
Sorry, did somebody say something? Okay. Yeah, the conditions. How do you know that
Victor,
Yeah.
Could you mute everybody, because we're getting a lot of incidental noise?
All right. Okay. Where's the mute button for everybody? I usually don't mute people, but can somebody tell me where the mute button is? Is it down under the mute bar, or is it? I can mute specific people, but how do you?
You would have. Well, then how about Abby? She keeps coming up on.
Yeah, I think it was Abby that was.
Okay. All right. Here we go. Okay. Yeah, Abby, if you want to say something, just let me know. We'll put you back on. All right. The conditions that how do we know that something is suffering in the first place? Surprisingly, there's been very little research on this. There's been a lot of research on pain, but not suffering. And the reasons for that have a lot to do with the fact that pain gives off markers, empirical markers that scientists can study. They can see behaviors, they can see even physiological things that if you can detect pain in a way that is difficult to do with suffering, because suffering isn't the same thing. As I said, it involves a more sophisticated psychology than pain does. It's even possible to be suffering and not be in pain, and certainly to be in pain and not be suffering. How could that be? Well, we'll see in a moment when I give you the conditions that he gives. Okay, the first minimal conditions you have to have before you could say that an entity of any sort is suffering. It has to have that basic access consciousness. It has to be basically aware it must have at least access consciousness. It is capable of being environmentally informed. That's what access consciousness comes down to. You have some awareness of what's around you. That alone is not enough, but if you don't have that, you can't proceed with this an evaluation, judgment that they're suffering there. The next thing is considerably more sophisticated. You must have, according to him, what he calls a PSM, or a phenomenal self model. What this comes down to is that the experiencing entity must own its suffering. It must picture itself as capable of having experiences, of possessing them. That is, it's me, not that there's not just pain floating in the air, but I am having it. So there's an I, a subject, a soul, a self, a mind, something there. Or to put it in most general terms, he says, Metzinger wants to say that there's a thing that experiences, and secondly, it owns those experiences. It says, these are my experiences. Thus, there's an ontology here of experiences and their owners. Experiences don't exist absent owners, but it takes both of these two things to have a phenomenal self model. And this is another condition for suffering, but alone is not enough. There's more. A third thing that's required for suffering is he calls the NV condition, or negative valence condition. The experience must inspire aversion. To be suffering, the experiences of the owning thing are normatively devalued. In other words, bad. This implies the owning thing must be normatively equipped, which means the thing that we're talking about must be able to pass judgment and say, this is a bad thing. This is not good. So it must be experienced as a negative. It must be a negative experience to be suffering. You might say, well, if it's a positive experience, then it would still be an experience, but it would be suffering. And the fourth condition, final condition, I believe, is he calls the transparency condition. And this one is more harder to explain, but what it is the experience for the entity that's having it must be viewed by it as real, that is beyond subjective doubt. In other words, it's not dismissible as something isn't a thought. You know it's immediate. The connection between the owner and the experience is direct. It's not. You don't need to look at some. It's not mediated by representation. I cannot think in the middle of the throes of the experience that my experience is the result of this or that perceptual or circumstantial or conceptual mediation. In other words, I don't need to consult an instrument to know that I'm suffering. If I do, I'm not suffering. It's transparent to the owner of the experience that it is theirs. It's not mediated by having to consult with anyone else or anything else that you're having it. You don't have to see an example of this. A hard example would be while you're you can't, at the time you're having this experience, you're not, like say you're having your tooth drilled or something, you're not in a position to marvel at the fact that you have a nervous system and that it's reacting this way. It's very clear this is not just a tooth being drilled, it's your tooth being drilled. There's a clear, unobstructed path or connection from the experience to its owner. So if these are the four conditions he gives. So if something meets these four conditions, he's going to call it suffering.
Can you check? I'm sorry. Could you summarize them again? And I think I have an objection or at least a question about.
Okay, sure. By the way, these are written up in the extended write-up, so all this is spelled out there if you want. Okay, the first one is access consciousness. You have to be environmentally informed if you don't know what's going on around you. Someone perhaps in a coma wouldn't have this. Second, phenomenal self-model. You have to have a sense that there is a you there, a thing there that you identify with that is possessing, in some sense, owning the suffering. There's a thing, the world he imagines, there are things, I would say there are experiences, phenomenal experiences, and then there's their owners. So there has to be an owner for the experience. Experiences don't exist as free floating things in the air. They're disconnected from their owners. So the thing has to have that. Something that might not have it, think of I don't know about insects, but certainly as far as we know, single cell creatures, for example, may not need to have a PSM, a phenomenal self model, a sense of they are. You can have these behaviors manifest themselves, or at least it's conceivable that there's no sense of a bacteria knowing that it's a bacteria, or that it's this particular bacteria and not another one. That would be an example of something that, as far as we can tell, the bacteria doesn't have a self model, whereas higher animals probably do. Well, they certainly do. How far down is a matter of contention, but you have to have some sense of who you are, of that you have there's a there for you, so to speak. The third one is negative. It must be an experience that inspires aversion. In other words, it's bad. It's perceived as bad by the entity. And the fourth one is that for that thing that's having the experience, it's not an abstraction. It's something that they clearly have a direct path of the experience, and their ownership of it is direct. They don't have to consult instrumentation or other people or the environment. You know it's happening to you, and there's transparency in that connection, as opposed to it's not unconscious, for example.
It's that last one that I'm probably going to have a problem. And I don't want to make a big deal of it until you get it all out there. But I just think the other ones really kind of add up to what ours would call plurality, right? It's a sociality. You are one, and other people are others, like you supposedly, and so then that's sort of, in other words, like what's mine is mine is because it's not yours, right? So there's that difference there. But I think though. The one about the comfortability, the immediacy, you have to ask is like, people do often wonder, am I really saying, if you say so and so said something to me, whatever, and I'm suffering, it's like, oh, but does that really matter to you? You basically you consider argue suffering away in that way, whereas pain you would not. Pain is the physical.
Okay, well, here let me try that. You're right. This is one of the most difficult ones to express, but as I understand it. If you're suffering, you don't need to consult anyone else to know that you're suffering. If you do need to consult someone else to know whether you're suffering, then there's some that it's possible for others to see markers or indications or behavioral evidence that you're suffering, but you are not suffering. Okay, they may be projecting onto you something that isn't there. But then what is the difference? For you, you don't need. But for you, you don't need to consult others to know that you're suffering. Is this point? You may need to understand other people suffering. Yes, you do. This is where there's the other minds problem involved here. In the case of other people, our only way we can know that they're suffering is by observation.
All right. Well, then it runs sort of parallel with the private language debate with Wittgenstein.
Yeah.
So we can leave it at that for now. Yeah.
Right. I mean, yeah, we could. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So for Metzinger, if something meets all these criteria, then you say then it's suffering. So here's the thing, and this is where it starts to get really controversial. Nothing in any of these conditions we just stated says anything about biology. If there was some non-biological entity that met these conditions, we'd have to say it's suffering. So this leaves the door open for things like artificial suffering, phenomena that would be described as suffering because it met these conditions, but isn't happening to a biological being. Could be, again, assuming it met these conditions. And how would you know that it met these conditions? Well, you'd have to go through them and tick them off one at a time. Does it behave as though it was had access consciousness? That's pretty minimal bar to almost a lot of things. Even microbes meet that condition. That one is pretty easy. The others get increasingly difficult, but it's hard. Here's the thing. You may never be able to determine for sure if all those conditions are met. But if they appear to be met, that may be enough for there to be a moral obligation to attribute suffering to the entity, even if you can't know for sure that all these conditions are met, simply because they might be met. And in fact, this is exactly the same situation we are in when we talk about, in the other minds problems, when we talk about other people. How do we really know that someone's really suffering? Well, not without actually becoming them. There is no way to know. You can just look at the preponderance of the evidence. It sure looks like they're suffering. If you were in their position, you could imagine yourself suffering, and so forth and so forth. But all these are inferences made without that transparency condition. You have to consult evidence outside yourself to know this. So that's an important feature of this thing. This does not say anything about biology being required for suffering to happen. It does require something like something either like a nervous system or that functions functionally like a nervous system. It must be aware of its environment. The way biological beings are aware, of course, does involve our nervous system, but is that the only way it could be manifested? That's an open question. And so that's where we begin to see where this might lead. Why is this important? Why is it important to pin down what suffering is? Because according to Metzinger, if we don't have a clear understanding of what it is, we may be causing suffering without even being aware of it. And that has moral implications. And if we're in doubt about it, just as with judging human suffering, if you're not absolutely sure whether you're suffering, that some other person is suffering, but you have lots of evidence from the outside that they are suffering, we have a moral obligation to presume that they are, to assume they're not, or to put the burden of proving that they aren't suffering should be on us. We should morally assume if they look like they're suffering, that they're suffering. They might not be, but then there would have the burden of proving that would have to be on whoever wants to disprove it. But it's not, the moral imperative would suggest you take things at face value until you have reason to doubt it. But the moral burden is on the person who would doubt it, who would be critical, who would be suspicious that this wasn't suffering. In other words, if it looks like suffering, it probably is. You should assume that it is. And let me pause right there, because there's going to be more to be said about this in a moment. But surely this must have gotten somebody's interest. Does anybody want to raise your hand? Because I have the. Oh yeah, I guess anybody wants to comment on this so far? Okay, let's work out.
Well, actually, just wanted to address my concern so far, the direction it's going. It seems pretty analytic. I mean,
Yeah.
Immediately in the first 5-10 minutes of exposition, then skepticism rears its ugly head, right? It's like, the important thing about suffering is whether you're actually suffering or not. Well, that's one question. I mean, there's always going to be fakers, I suppose. But what does suffering do? Is Metzinger going to have anything to say about why there is suffering?
Oh, why it exists in the first place? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, yeah, apart from pain, which I'm still not quite clear how suffering is different
okay.
from pain.
No, he does. Actually, that was something I did mention earlier. The fact that reflective consciousness in some beings has evolved, it evolved because there was suffering to deal with. The evolution of consciousness was a response to pressures that pure access consciousness could not handle. For example, organisms that are develop a sense of their own futures, extended futures, have plans way out in the distance, not like where instinct alone, like a squirrel gathering nuts for the upcoming cold winter, that can be perhaps genetically programmed, but a squirrel having an insurance plan just in case there aren't enough nuts this year, that requires pretty advanced planning and a sense of a strong sense of not just memory and imagination are involved here. Reflective consciousness goes with memory and imagination to be have a sense that you were shaped by past experiences and that you will have to deal or anticipate future experiences that counterfactuals, things that aren't true here and now. That yourself extends into the past and into the future arises with reflective consciousness. And having that ability, supposedly, was selected for because it allowed organisms with that ability to thrive, to do better than organisms that could not think that far ahead beyond the next season, perhaps. Or there's no thinking at all. It's all pre-programmed or instinctive.
I mean, I'm not one of those big boosters of animal consciousness, so I won't take too much on that, except that I think, I don't know, I mean, I think the animal part of it isn't the animal versus the, well, when we call it, the enlightenment idea of what animals are, that they're completely instinct driven.
Mm-hmm.
What makes human suffering special, while there might not be squirrel suffering, although I could be convinced the other way, I think, is that we actually communicate a lot more, and of course other mammals do communicate, so that's why I'm wavering on that. So I mean, it's just we're putting it on one of these weird. You're still smuggling in the really pretty rudimentary ideas about other life forms that come out of the Enlightenment, right? And of course there were political reasons why they went that way.
Well, most of these ideas are from evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology that everything we have didn't come out of the blue. And also I'm making it sound like there's a strong division between access and reflective consciousness. There's a continuum here. It's not to say that even squirrels don't have reflective consciousness. This is there isn't a cutoff point where one animal at an earlier stage only had access consciousness and suddenly reflective consciousness came along. The idea it's a continuum. From at one extreme, you can imagine something with only access consciousness. Maybe there isn't such a thing, but there's certainly things that appear to have no more than that at one end. And at the other end are us, who, as far as we know right now, are the only ones who are the highest performers in the area of reflective consciousness so far. Now we're going to get to something later that may question that, whether we are the be-all and end-all of reflective consciousness, but as in the natural world, we are the pinnacle of it.
I can see your dog got interested in the conversation there when we started talking about animals.
Yeah. And again, it's not an all or nothing thing. It's just that there are these things we can distinguish, and there's in all likelihood it's a continuum here. So this raises the question about what about artificial intelligence, or AGI, or artificial general intelligence? At what point can we even begin to sensibly start talking about the possibility of an artificial entity having, or being capable of having, experiencing negatively valenced states, pain and suffering, in other words? Well, and when that happens, suddenly this opens the door to a whole bunch of moral questions. But for example, let's start with something minimally intelligent, a light switch. There are no ethical issues that I'm aware of in which we could say that we need to be responsible in how we turn on light. For the sake of the light switch, I don't mean that we could really consider responsible in terms of wasting energy, but that's not related to the light switch. It's just a tool, a device that does one thing very well, but does it simple. A laptop, a word processing program, for example, that is able to scan your document and advise you that there's a misspelled word if it's working correctly. Is that intelligent enough to? Could you possibly abuse a laptop or a program on a laptop or the laptop itself? Most people would say not. It's still at the level of a tool. The next level would be something, a computer program to optimize and preserve its own structure and function. Now we're beginning to get closer because we're beginning to talk about things that are autonomous, or at least to some degree autonomous. And autonomy, it turns out is going to be an important factor in where the moral considerations become relevant. And one level further is a computer that expressing through its behavior optimization or preservation of its structure or function. Now we're talking about, it doesn't have to be a computer, just any kind of artificial system that is able through, and it's observable through its behavior or through its communication, either way, that it's clearly interested in preserving itself and whatever its function is. And is able to take some action to preserve it, to keep itself going. Okay, at this point, if you try to frustrate such a machine by trying to destroy it, for example, would you have done something that is morally suspect? Are you getting into a realm where moral considerations are relevant? At this point, decisions about why or why not we should consider its moral agency or patiency. Agency means the thing is able to be responsible for its own behavior. It makes choices the way we assume people do. Or patiency, meaning that it's at the receiving end of behavior by other things that could make it a victim of someone else's actions, like a child, for example. A system, any kind that behaves recognizably in this way, as people and all living things do, becomes thereby an object of moral consideration. Now we have to start talking about morality. And this is one of the things that Metzinger is motivating his concern. I'm putting in my own words what he talks about. Shall we design our intelligent, potentially conscious creations with biases to match our own? Shall we make them gluttons for punishment, all the while happy enough to preserve their structure and function? Shall we divorce them from the reality as we do ourselves? Isn't there enough pain and suffering in the universe without our contributing to it? Must we follow in the footsteps of nature or an alleged intelligent designer? Okay, there's something, by the way, that I need to go back that's going to tie up with this, and that has to do with happiness. And another aspect of suffering. Metzinger did a preliminary study. It's a small study, and it's not probably scientifically conclusive, but it does connect with other related studies that people who study consciousness have been doing for the past few decades or so. He was trying to figure this out. Are living things like us, for example, do we continue with our lives because we're happy most of the time? What he did I think he had a bunch of grad students carry around a phone that had an app designed to poll them periodically about random times during waking hours over a course of several weeks, asking them, okay, are you, the past few seconds, is that moment one that you would consider one that you'd be worth reliving forever and ever? Yes or no? And he collected the data. What he found was that almost 70% of those moments were negative ones, or the ones where people say, no, it wasn't worth reliving over and over again forever. Now that's not the same thing as asking whether someone's happy, but it is a data point. It suggests that most of our lives, 2/3 of the time at least, we are not actually enjoying what we're doing, whatever it is we're doing. At least not enough to say that we would be willing to repeat that moment again. In fact, it's kind of surprising that as many as 30% said they would. And there's some other confounding things going on here that make it even more interesting. By the way, somebody suggested, well, they probably, the way it was phrased, it should have been phrased differently. It should have been said, are you willing to repeat that moment where we just told you even one more time? Because I can easily imagine someone saying that, yeah, that last moment was great, but not forever and ever in this eternal playlist, as he called it. But when they dropped the eternal playlist, it actually got worse. So that wasn't confounding the answers. They did the study again, this time saying, are you willing to relive that moment even one time? Again, the numbers were actually slightly worse. So what does this mean? It seems to suggest that a majority of the time that we are alive, we are not exactly enjoying our lives. And this is, again, this is a preliminary study. But more interesting still, though, is what happened when the students or the people who were subjects in the experiment were presented with the data, the evidence. They were actually surprised. They said, they were shocked that a large percentage of the time they weren't particularly happy with their lives or what they were doing. And then they started giving reasons, or you could say rationalizations, for why that is. And we got suddenly a whole bunch of responses which sound very much like rationalizations, but they might be true, but a rationalization can actually be true. But things like, well, there are more important things in life than happiness. Like I have a project I'm trying to accomplish. I have certain duties that I'm glad I'm doing them, and they're onerous duties. They're not exactly fun. I'm doing some job, for example, that it's not exactly fun, but I feel in some sense fulfilled because I'm doing something constructive for the community or something. It's not fun, but it's important. You would get these kinds of alternate reasons for why people kept on going, even though happiness wasn't the principal one. What this suggests, according to him, that we don't really need happiness is not actually a major force in what keeps us going. That if it were, and we were rational also, we would have all given up a long time ago. There must be other things that have nothing to do with happiness, which is why we keep going. Because if that was it, and unless we were irrational, and maybe we are, we would have given up. Which raises the question of, okay, so I see some hands up here, so I want to pause here. Mike and Ruth, I forget which of you had it first. Do you know who goes first?
Why don't you go ahead, Ruth?
Okay, go ahead, Ruth.
Can you define happiness?
What?
Can you define happiness? Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
I have a definition for happiness, but it might not be the same definition that you're thinking of.
Well, as far as I know, there is no agreed upon consensus opinion about what happiness is. And the same thing is true for suffering, as a matter of fact. And that's exactly what Metzinger is trying to do, provide a tentative, working hypothesis about what suffering is. And we could do exactly the same thing for happiness as well. But as far as a settled definition, there are probably 1,000 of them.
Yeah. Well, Buddha says that happiness is detachment.
Is detachment, okay?
Yeah.
Detachment. Metzinger is very sympathetic to Buddhist philosophy. He might agree with you about that, but go ahead. Could you help us? Could you explain detachment a little bit for us? Like, what is it?
So, like, the less you care about things, the less you're attached, the happier you are, because hey, I don't care. It's all good. I mean, wasn't he like a king and he left everything and he went out to beg on the streets? And he was happy because he had no worries, nothing holding him down. He was completely detached and he was happy. So he says that detachment is happiness.
Okay. I mean, that's a good start. But my question would be, and I think would be this. Is happiness a good thing or not?
That is a completely different question.
Yeah, I know it's different, but is it or not?
I don't think there's a definitive answer to that.
Well, I could give some, well, certain, I could say, for the being we're talking about, the detached person, if it genuinely gives them a sense of positive experience being detached, then obviously for them it is good. But is it good independent of them? Is it good for humanity as a whole, for all living things?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the question.
Yeah.
I think that for humanity on its own, like as a whole, I would say too much detachment would be a bad thing, but you do need a certain amount of detachment. I mean, you can't have everyone running around constantly, concerned about everything.
Yeah.
Because you can't live like that.
I understand. That makes perfect sense. But it does
You
raise,
have to have a certain amount of detachment just to exist.
exactly.
So,
To
like
survive.
everything else in life, I would say that it's a matter of dose.
Okay. All right. I can agree with that, but there's some other issues. But who was Vincent and Mike? I think Mike, you were the next person, right?
Oh, yeah, okay. About the AI. So, I mean, it's called artificial intelligence, and I'm thinking now for a good reason, because I mean, it's not real, in the sense of the substrate being the same. Really, in this ontology, Victor, that you were talking about, or that's Metzinger's, I guess, there has to be an owner, and the owner in AI, there isn't one really. It's just um, the way it is right now, of a electronic type of substrate that we're typically using. I mean, even in quantum, I guess if you went to quantum, basically the situation is the same. Now, if the substrate changed radically in terms of perhaps, and there's one researcher who I actually know personally, he lives in Australia, and he's trying to create thought using electromagnetic fields. And so that's a radically different substrate. Now, if I could see the argument being made that if the electronic structure that he's creating is the same as ours, if it's functionally and structurally the same as the cycles that we have, then you could kind of start making the argument that the machine has real, not artificial intelligence, and is actually suffering. And I think you can make the argument there a little bit more coherently, but still, it's too hard to prove. But there's a lot of work done in AI on simulating emotions, but there's no real owner usually. There's not an I. There kind of is, because I mean, a lot of AI is predicated on loss, a loss function or a reward function. There's a lot of reinforcement, but they don't really distinguish between, is it pain really, or is it suffering? It's nobody really goes that far. Sometimes there's a conference called BICA, Brain Inspired Computer Architecture. I think they keep changing their acronym, but anyway, they deal more in these types of issues. But still, I mean, unless you had a completely different substrate, I just don't buy that a machine's really going to suffer. But just to wrap up my point, if the suffering's ours, like remember that washing machine being abused video you used to show? So somebody turns on a washing machine, they turn it on, and they have it on full blast. The thing starts to shake apart, and you're just thinking, oh my God, how can that wash? I just stop it suffering, but there's no suffering going on there. It's us. We're the ones suffering.
Well, yeah, okay. That we're going to come back to that that washing machine. By the way, there's for those who haven't seen it, there's a great video. There's a link to it in the full write-up. It's 10 years ago, and there are many videos like this, but this one is one of the more dramatic ones, in which this guy in Australia in his backyard had a bunch of old appliances, and he liked destroying them on YouTube and then putting out the things and because the sheer spectacle of watching something destroy itself. And the washing machine became a really, I mean, it wasn't a washing machine, it was a dryer, it was an electric dryer. What he did was he hot-wired the dryer so that its safety mechanisms that would automatically shut it off if it got, imbalanced, wouldn't work. So it was going to run and run and run until something broke. And it's pretty dramatic what happens. What was interesting about it, first of all, it got 10 million views. So I mean, it's been there and it's still very popular. Okay. What was interesting about it is this. Most people thought it was just a hell of a lot of fun to watch this thing destroy itself. But there were some interesting comments that suggested some people were disturbed. They found it even terrifying to watch this machine. Does it even look like a robot or has anything to do with intelligence? To watch it slowly destroy itself in a very, what seems like if it were a living thing, it would be a horribly terrible way to die. And they were, some of them even accused the guy who put the video up of being a disturbed person, that he was mentally perverse, like someone who would torture babies and put it on YouTube. This was not a baby. It was a dryer that was nothing more intelligent or human-looking like or animal-like than a dryer. But it was still able to evoke these kinds of empathetic responses from people. And some of them weren't, some people were. And some people, in fact, most people probably experienced both. They were both fascinated by what they were looking at the same time, they were a little bit horrified by it. And it's the horrified part that brings in another dimension to this. Because it suggests, as there's a researcher at MIT, her name's Kate Darling, who studies the interaction between robotics or technology and moral and legal issues. And one of her concerns is that, or discoveries, is that human beings are hardwired to respond to anything that looks even vaguely autonomous, that moves, and is apparently experiencing suffering. And of course, you can know in your head this is not a living thing, but some people have very strong reactions to this, and almost everybody has some kind of negative reaction, even while at the same time they may be enjoying it on some thrill level. It is fascinating to watch. But it's and what her conclusion is that we need to start thinking about the ethical and legal, because in other words, whether a machine, whether it looks like a robot, no matter how intelligent or unintelligent it looks like, if it just occasionally behaves in a way that is like a living thing, that's all it takes to trigger this response. And it could mean that there will be laws regulating what you can do to, say, robots, as though they had rights to, be protected the way animals and small children do. You just can't do anything you want to it. No one takes that too seriously now, but as these devices become increasingly more capable of evoking these responses from us, we're going to have moral and legal issues. And that's there's a video, there's a link to the dryer video, and also right next to it, it's in one of the footnotes in the extended write-up, to a TED Talk that she gives. She explains this. There's also an interview there with her. And she's not alone. And this was like 7 or 8 years ago that this first came up. And then in the intervening time, there's been a lot more work done on this. And it raises the question Mike's question about the substrate. Is it really have much to do with the substrate, or does it have to do with us because frankly, I don't know what the substrate is of other human beings. I've never been inside the gray matter of anyone else, not even my own. So we don't really interact with substrates. We interact with what we can perceive, behavior, speech patterns, and it's that we our psychologies evolved working with, not substrates. And that's why a lot of this work goes beyond being concerned about what the thing is made of, and more concerned about what the thing appears to be mimicking or behaving like, as though it were suffering. If something is behaving as though it were suffering, it may as well, as far as humans are concerned, be suffering, because how do we know that other people aren't really suffering? We just assume they are. We have no reason to doubt it. We take things pretty much as they appear to be. Whether in some deeper, there are ways out of this by insisting that suffering and pain are, strictly speaking, biological phenomena. If they aren't biological, they can't happen. So you can't have pain and suffering in a machine. And if we could make a perfectly indistinguishable human-like robot that you could have conversations with and never know that they were not made of flesh and blood, that they could not experience pain and suffering, or pleasure and happiness for that matter, because they aren't made of the right kind of stuff. And only if they're made of the right kind of stuff can they have that. That's, I think John Searle famously took a view similar to that. But the functionalist view argues that it's actually is now beginning to find support from evolutionary biology, because again, we don't deal with substrates, as I said later. We deal with observable behavior. That's what gets reactions from us, from our behavior. And our whole moral and legal systems are founded on that, on what is visible, not what's going on at some subatomic level. Most people, lawyers and people who are concerned about moral issues, don't need to know physics in order to be able to say something about those things. So anyway, that's a substrate question. Vincent, go ahead. I'm sorry, I went on.
Oh, that's okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, so I guess I'll go backwards. Yes, that's what you said, Victor. Last was super interesting. Yeah, I think reiterating that point you made about we don't interact with the substrates, we interact with the, let's just call it, the modeling of what our brains have already evolved to detect as other agents, right? The intentional stance, as Dennett would call it, right? And the washing machine example, also, I haven't seen it. It is fascinating, and I don't know much about Kate Darling's work, but it does kind of sound like something that I kind of familiar about with the psychological inner workings of what is kind of confusing in psychology when they call it theory of mind. It's not like like theory of mind is like the theory, but that it is let's just call it the computational evolved software that's already in our brains, that it's evolved for a particular evolutionary reason, probably some type of social interaction component, right? That we see other agents that seem like to be that they have themselves agenticity or intentionality as other objects that automatically therefore have a mind like ours, right? Because that's philosophically, you get into that other minds problem where we can say it's very difficult to philosophize that we actually have direct evidence, right, that someone else is having that direct subjective experience. But that theory of mind component in our brains is very similar to a lot of other kind of basic functionalities in our brains, as of seeing faces, for example. There's a lot of research showing that, right, we directly see faces because we already have a model of a face, right? That's why we can see faces in the cloud, right? In the clouds. But that's also why with this agent theory of mind, if we see a cloud that looks like a face and is like moving in a certain direction, right? We might think that the clouds up there have some type of agenticity or intentionality. right? There's some theories about that's where, right, kind of like those ideas about religiosity came from, is from that. So that's also really fascinating. In any of those things, again, there's a lot of research just saying like if we don't have or you have aphasia where you don't actually have the sensory component in your brain that you can see as a face, people actually can't see faces. They actually can't recognize other people because of that, right? Even if they're like their wives or sons or mothers, they walk into a room and until like maybe they hear their voice, they're just like, who are you? Or you're just another, kind of bag of flesh sitting right there that I don't recognize. So it's interesting that you make that point, that going back to what is it that we're interacting with when it comes to the substrate of other agents, right? The reason that we already understand or interact with these other beings is because of some, at least theoretically, an evolutionary reason. And it therefore kind of goes back to that point that what is the substrate that we require in order to have some form of consciousness. And that kind of gets to Mike's point, right? Kind of talking about like that artificial versus real binary, right? It's interesting how like they call it artificial intelligence, but that's not like it's not saying that like it's because it's artificial therefore it's not real, right? That whole duality is just a conceptual function, right, to help us understand that what is artificial about it is not biological, and that's all it's saying, right? It's designed by humans instead of being quote unquote designed by evolution, right? And so kind of going back to Metzinger's point about again, he definitely comes from the evolutionary biology kind of school of thought, right? He kind of rejects the Chalmers version of like that there are possible zombies that could still be fully biologically somewhat of an agent, but lack the phenomenal quality of experience. So again, what he's suggesting is that like all that we know of consciousness and all that we've so far experienced of consciousness has come through the process of evolution. But he's just therefore saying, but how can we rule out that through some other process, as long as we can have the conceptual framework that he's proposing here, right? It's a very tentative conceptual framework that does not itself make the assumption that consciousness can only come from the biological evolutionary process. Then we have to at least be open to coming with a conceptual framework that can therefore hopefully detect, right, when there is in fact some form of suffering that is not simply just what he calls, simple pain, right? I'll finish with going back to Ruth's point about the Buddhist philosophy. There was even a section in Metzinger's paper on suffering when he's discussing the different options, and he says there's about minimizing suffering. He says there's a third option to minimize suffering, which would consist in eliminating not conscious experience as such, but only self-consciousness. Here, the PSM condition, right, that you actually have this self model that itself is just a evolutionary construct, right? Itself is a optimizing construct in order to help us survive, right? In order to help us want to continue and propagate more of us. If we didn't have this PSM, as a lot of Buddhists would then say, oh, that's the very cause of suffering, is because we have this PSM. And Buddhists would then say, resulting, if we can make this form of phenomenal selfhood disappear, because that's where all suffering comes from, right? Life is suffering, as one of the noble truths, according to the Buddha. Conscious states could still exist, but certain complex phenomenal properties would be instantiated anymore, most notably the qualities of selfhood, this ownership and agency. And this option 3 has been investigated in depth, according to Metzinger, for example, by, he says, 25 centuries of Buddhist philosophy. So he even says that, like, the Buddhists are very aware, right, that, we kind of understand that if we take that original experiment and say that, like, if all subjective experiences are just another succession of judging whether or not it's some type of hedonistic, right, pleasurable experience, typically we would say most of those experiences in our lives are not wanted to be repeated. Therefore, the way out of suffering would be to eliminate that one component of your consciousness, which would be the PSM, right? We eliminate that we actually have an ego, that we have this sense of self, and that, maybe the Buddhists were right that, this is just a self-construction, right? And one of the things, going back to Mike's example, right, this kind of a substrate, it's interesting that when you're asking about where is the owner whenever we talk about artificial intelligence, right? And we usually automatically, and maybe this is one of those blind spots in Western philosophy, right? We automatically kind of think of the owner as a substance, right? The classic Western substance, right? Whatever that means, which means it probably has to be some type of, right, extended thing. And then of course, that's why we get these confusing Cartesian ideas. It's like, well, if everything is substance is extended, the mind is not extended in space, but maybe it's extended in time. Therefore, that's why we have this duality, right? Because consciousness can only exist outside of extension and only exist within time, but therefore it's separated from the extended substance. And that itself is just a major problem in philosophy that people are like, oh, that's just silly, right? That creates too many problems itself. So that's what's interesting when a Metzinger defines what is the owner condition. It just means that because there is this condition where there is a system that is forward-looking and also past-looking as well, and that once it has certain levels of desires or wants, or whatever you want to call that it's wanting to achieve a particular objective, right? If that objective is somewhat thwarted or mitigated or minimized or prevented, then if there is that self-reflection of, oh, I did not achieve what I wanted to do, right? And that could be whatever it wants, right? There's no quote unquote happiness condition where it's like you only have to want the right kinds of things in order to be happiness. You can't just want, to stab yourself in the eye all the time, right? That would obviously violate your own interest in wanting to continue to achieve whatever it is you want to achieve. Then therefore, then we can say there maybe is some type of owner, right? The owner is just whatever system somehow loops around itself and says, I am trying to correct whatever it is that I right, want to do. And you can even say that about biological systems. There is no I, right? We are just a collection, actually, of a bunch of zillion. Then it would say we're a bunch of zillion robots working together, right? But he means just like we're a bunch of just a zillion little bacterias. A bacteria is also an agent, right? Even though it doesn't, the bacterium in your body doesn't have that kind of self-reflective consciousness to think about itself. But we are, you're right, just this total collection of smaller cells that eventually build up to perhaps you might say a larger one. And then that PSM is that just guiding tool that has been evolved in order to, well, let's just say we got to maintain something, right? I can't survive without this particular body because it's a collection of a bunch of zillion bacterium or robots. And therefore, perhaps that is the thing that needs to be quote unquote protected. And that is the thing that needs to be propagated in the future, right? I'll leave it there and continue to see if anybody else has any other issues. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Vincent. Ruth, you still have your hand up. Do you want to say something? Or?
Yeah. I'm struggling with this whole washing machine thing you were talking about, because I mean, people are genetically predisposed to not care about someone who isn't part of their group. And so how does someone care about a washing machine while we have this ability to be totally cruel to other people just because they're a little bit different from us? I mean, when a country goes to war, you have to paint the other side as evil. You have to make it us versus them. I'm kind of not buying the whole washing machine thing.
Oh, okay. First of all, it isn't if people, and this is a big if, and the answer is probably we're not, but if we were rational, what you're saying would be a problem. But that's a very unwarranted assumption that people are rational. They can easily feel compassion for some things and not others. They can say, these are people I know or I'm close to, I feel I will help them. These other people I don't care about. And they could change their minds about these things. And they could even change their minds about the same people. One day they love them, the next day they're really ready to kill them. All of this is consistent with human nature. That's because you're trying to look for a reason for organization that just isn't there. We're not as rational as perhaps we'd like to think we are. And that's going to be coming up soon as another point of discussion. But you're absolutely right. And as far as the washing machine is Kate Darling, who I highly recommend listening to her TED Talk, there's a link to, as well as her interview, gives lots of examples of how we, even people that, even in situations that just don't, you wouldn't think these people would express and have empathetic reactions to things to such an extent that it alters their behavior. And it's not like people are choosing to do this. She's pointing to very hardwired, our empathy, in other words, is hardwired to whatever degree we have it. Some people don't have much of it at all. Some people have excess amounts. Most of us have some to some degree. But there's no necessary connection between having empathetic abilities or capacities and employing them in a coherent, rational, consistent way. That we might wish that were the case, but there's very little evidence for that it actually happens with any great regularity. Another example that she gives in her talk, which I think is very dramatic, she talks about a real case of there is a military robot that was made specifically for finding and triggering landmines in enemy territory. It was a machine. It was designed almost like a gigantic centipede with lots of legs, and its purpose was to go track the territory and step on landmines and trigger them. And every time that would happen, one of its legs would be blown off, and but its job was to continue to do this until they couldn't do it anymore. And they were testing this machine, and one of the military people who was running the show at the time, after watching this thing successfully trigger quite a few landmines, but it was as a machine, it was determined to continue to destroy itself slowly until it couldn't destroy any more, trigger any more landmines. The military official who was conducting the test ended it prematurely, and his reason was that he couldn't bear to see this machine slowly suffer. And this is a machine that's designed for military purposes. These are people who are sent out to go out and kill people. So even such people were, you could say, irrationally responding to something they saw that looked like it was an animal and it was slowly suffering. And he had to call it off for that reason. And that's a striking example of how powerful these hardwired reactions we have can be. And it's not that they're rational or not, it's happening at some deeper level.
And so you asked earlier on whether you can have irrational intelligence, and I think that answers the question that yes, you can have irrational intelligence.
Yeah, thanks. We'll come back to that in a moment, but yeah, that's good. Angie, go ahead, Angie, before I go on to something else. Go ahead.
Yeah, I always wonder psychologically how male and female deal with pain and suffering differently, because biologically, most women have to deal with pain and suffering every month through our, biological clock, through menstrual cramp and pain period. And that's something that males never have to do, don't know how to deal with it on a monthly basis. And I just wonder if there's got to be something psychologically that equip women to maybe we have to deal with it differently because we have to deal with it more frequently. Not to mention the social stigma when we complain about the pain, we'll be labeled as complainer. We're exaggerating. Yada. There's that social stigma too, and that kind of makes me think. I think females maybe tend to deal with pain and suffering in silence than males, probably.
Yeah,
that's all. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Angie. That's a great observation. In fact, it may help explain why this is an unusual. At the moment, I think it's still male, overwhelmingly male. But the number of women who signed up for this meetup thing, we've been doing this since 2016. I've never had as many women sign up for an event as we did this time. It's as though suffering was an important subject or one that women were more willing to discuss openly than men were. Maybe I don't know for a fact. I don't know what's really going on, but I have to speculate something like that is going on. And yes, you're absolutely right. I'm not sure that we could say that, from what I understand, because I've actually looked a little bit into the gender and sex differences between different phenomenologies there are between male and female, not specifically on this topic, but in other contexts. And I'm not sure that it's that men feel less or more pain, or that women feel less or more pain, but there is definitely a difference in how they react to it and how they express it, how willing they are to express it, and what kinds of pain. Some kinds of pain women are more sensitive to, and some kinds of pain men are more sensitive to. And how they express it is different enough that you might get the impression that men don't feel pain, real men don't feel pain, but I don't think that's the case. That it's different, absolutely, that's true. And there's a well-known recent study that was actually noted by a team of female psychologists, that they were asking, why is it that males tend to make such a big deal about suffering from a cold or a flu? And it turns out there is a reason. And the very mechanism that permits women to be parents and mothers actually gives them at a certain level a stronger immune system than males do. They need it evolutionarily from a perspective of being able to survive having to deal in close, intimate connections with children, for example. They have to have stronger immune systems just to survive. And so women, according to these studies, do not experience a cold or flu in quite as severe, the same symptoms in general than males do. Men actually do suffer more during colds and flus than women do. At least they're, according to these studies. But you're right, there are other kinds of pain and suffering that are very specifically female and that men never experience, or if they do, they don't experience it to the same degree. So there are differences, absolutely. I don't know quite if it rises to the level of saying that one gender or sex is more or less vulnerable to pain or suffering, but that it's different. That part, I think there's plenty of evidence for. Vincent, did you want to say something else, or?
Yeah, I did. I wanted to say something a little bit about what I think Ruth was saying. And yes, it was a very interesting question about the distinction between that if we're hardwired to have, again, what many psychologists call the theory of mind, right? We already are built into with these mechanisms in order to let's just call it have empathy and sympathy for automatically other seemingly agents who your brain also detects has a mind. And so we could just go ahead and say that there's an evolutionary reason for that development of theory of mind, and it probably has to do with the basic functionality of caring for each other in a society in order for there to be collective survival, right? Instead of just all for one, right? And then that we would be less likely to survive or propagate our species unless we were working together. And that is totally compatible with also having stronger kinship mechanisms, right? That we are more likely to survive as long as we have higher levels of let's just call it kinship empathy, right? Where it's like you have more empathy for those who have more or less your DNA, right? And therefore you have less empathy for, as you go down the scale, people having less DNA. So right, you'd be like one half willing to die for your son or your mother, but you would only be maybe 1/4 willing to die for your cousin or something like that. So those are completely compatible. Again, we're not talking about rationality here, right? Because that then becomes some type of like self-aware, self-regulating conception of the very mechanisms that we already have, right? So again, I'm kind of discounting any kind of talk of whatever rationality that means. Just talking about these evolutionary mechanisms that say it's completely compatible, and it's super complex, right? To say that like we both have a theory of mind developed to care for other people, but we also have developments of kinship relations that determine our moral stance toward other minds.
Yeah.
And then kind of leading to this question last proposed about the difference of men and women experiencing pain. Actually, I'm not sure if I remember what I was going to say about that. Yeah, I'll stop there since I don't know.
Okay, but that
Yeah.
part I get, but then why would a machine evoke these types of feelings? Because you have no DNA connection to a machine.
It's because our brains don't have the sophistication to necessarily detect whether or not as going back to what Victor said, we don't interact with the substrates, right? Our brains don't automatically just say, oh, that's a piece of metal, therefore it doesn't have a mind. All it's looking for, again, is kind of getting down to the basics, right? Might be something like, not that it has flesh, but that maybe it has either a face or some other almost kind of unconsciously detectable things about being an agent, right? An agent that looks like it's moving and doing something. It has some type of goal or purpose, and our brains are automatically wired to detect that intentionality before you even have more rational awareness of it, right? And so you might have this feeling toward the machine that it makes you feel like, oh, this is making me feel gross, right? Even though when I asked you, is that really a washing machine? You're like, yeah, that is. No, I know it's a washing machine. I know all it is just this the simple machine with wires and whatever. But then when I go back and look at the video, your brain still says, oh, that's disturbing, because your brain is saying it looks like it's an agent doing something with a purpose, with intentionality, and that's why it's disturbing.
And yet, to go to a really extreme case, during the Holocaust, the Nazis had no problem gassing millions of people, shooting babies, doing all sorts of atrocious things to other human beings. And I'm just struggling with conflating those two things.
Yeah, it's
with like reconciling those two things.
Right. I mean, and I think that's why, philosophers and historians have been trying to figure that out, using both this kind of like biological understanding about how our brains work at a very basic level, and at the same time, how can these things also happen at the same time, where there's there's atrocious murders and that kind of thing. There's sometimes you could just say there are simple explanations to, you might say, to the general pathology of those individual actors, right? For example,
there were too many of them, though.
That's right. So that's why taking this step by step, you say it's either the individual pathology of those people, or there's something about the larger form of power and control that was developed by the Nazis, which gets into a whole other complicated, right, phenomenology of how do agents who are themselves intentional agents act in that way, right? But remember this kind of whole discussion, I'm not talking anything about rationality. I'm kind of ignoring that there's possibly this kind of free will rationality loop back onto ourselves. And that, simply put, if we do have these basic functionalities of empathy, theory of mind, kinship relations, what that says is just that there are ways in which societies and dictators can bypass those very mechanisms. And you might even argue that that's what becomes the scary genius of some of these systems of thought, Nazism or fascism or the like, that find ways of hacking into, right, to use this artificial intelligence, hacking into our operating systems because they understand clearly how those operating systems work. You could even say this about cult leaders.
You could even say this about our politics, the way the left and the right hate each other.
Precisely, right? And even some Democrats get frustrated with Republicans, or sorry, with the people who counsel Republicans and Democrats, because typically they say Republicans understand human psychology better than the Democrats, meaning that they understand it better and they understand how to manipulate the very basic, as that kind of new emerging science
I think they're both equally good at it, personally.
That might be the case. So that's what's funny when you hear like Democrats or strategists arguing, just like, damn it, the Republicans understand this better than we do, or at least the Democrats have you might just argue maybe a better moral framework maybe for tapping into that. But you're probably also right that all politicians,
again,
that's what they do.
It's how you view it, whether who's more on the moral side and who's less on the moral side. And this is the problem. Okay, as an independent, I'm probably not part of this whole push-pull thing, which is why I can see it on both sides, okay? And it's equal on both sides. I see the spin on the right, I see the spin on the left, and it boggles my mind that on the right, they understand the spin on the left, and on the left, they understand the spin on the right, but neither of them can see their own spin.
Yeah, thanks. I'll have to move on. Thanks a lot, Ruth and Vincent, for this. I mean, I do find what you guys were saying very interesting. But I was going to move on with the topic, because there's actually the most controversial stuff is still to come. But there is something that you guys, or you mentioned, Ruth, about okay, there are different conceptions of. Philosophers have been arguing about morality and what is the correct moral theory for ages, since the beginning of all philosophy, as far as I know, and it's not settled. There are definitely certain schools that are dominant, and there aren't that many actually. I would suggest there's only about 4 distinct, different moral theories that have any kind of traction today among serious philosophers who've devoted their whole lives to studying moral theory. And one of these, I've done a survey of them in the past, but maybe one of these days I need to do it again, because it's really core to a lot of this stuff. But one of those, or 2 of those, are going to come into play in this next section here. So I'm going to move on to this, and this is going to raise a lot of questions, I'm sure. One of the things that appears in Metzinger's, both in the interview that I put up there and in the paper Suffering, he mentions this. And it's a very provocative thought experiment, which is what philosophers do all the time to test certain ideas. Thought experiments are sort of like crash testing ideas. You slam them against the wall as hard as you can and see what survives. And thereby you figure out what is rock and solid and what is shaky and what is still not developed. If the thing breaks, then you need to figure out what's wrong here. Or maybe it doesn't break, but you don't know how to fix it. Slamming it against the wall is one way to bring out its weaknesses in it, so that you can look and see what, if anything, can be done to fix the situation. And I think Metzinger has a very, beautiful, from a philosophical point of view, thought experiment here. maybe a disturbing one with a very disturbing conclusion too, but that's what makes it for a philosopher beautiful, that there's no easy way out of it. Okay, he imagines this situation. Suppose we someday at some point have an artificial general intelligence in whatever form we manage to put it together, that is programmed with something called negative utilitarian normative firmware that pedestalizes or puts to the highest level the minimization of suffering. Okay, right. The principle here is a little suffering is better than a lot of it, and better still is none at all. Okay, that's a very simple moral imperative, a commandment. If any kind of thing could either minimize suffering to the point of eliminating it, wouldn't that be a good thing? It does seem on the surface like that would be a good thing. Okay, now suppose we were able to make this artificial intelligence much more capable than we are, much more intelligent than we are, and very importantly, much more benevolent than we have any history of being ourselves. This thing, unlike us, history just is full of humanity inflicting suffering on itself, but this machine would be single-mindedly programmed to carry out this program of eliminating all pain and suffering from anywhere that it has power over. The entire planet, the universe, even if it could pull it off. Suppose it was programmed to do that, and it had the vast amounts of capability and the knowledge to do so, vast amounts of intelligence. But unlike us, it would be better than we are. Not as good, not as capable, not as intelligent, but better, supremely better in all those areas than we are. What if there were such an artificial intelligence? What if that even if we only get part of the way there, if you can get part of the way there, the possibility that we get pretty close to something like what I described doesn't seem that far-fetched. Okay, so what would happen? Metzinger says, look, what it would do is that it would decide to nip all pain and suffering in the bud by euthanizing all of us, all living things, and making sure that we did not reproduce, because this would prevent vast amounts of future suffering, and it would reduce it, not minimize it, but to zero. If there's nothing around that can suffer, there will be no pain or suffering at all. Remember, we human beings are pushed and pulled in very inconsistent, incoherent directions simultaneously, and that's probably why our history is so messed up. We want this, but we want that too. We want, but this machine has one commandment, one that it is going to instantiate without wavering from its imperative: eliminate pain and suffering. There is no better way to do it than by eliminating everything that's alive that could possibly experience pain and suffering. And it could be said, it would be, you could say, but what about the pain and suffering of those things that would be euthanized? Wouldn't they be harmed by euthanizing them? They want to continue to live. Aren't we harming them? Wouldn't this thing create suffering by killing us all off? Well, here's how it would respond. It would say, it is rational and morally justifiable to do so, to eliminate all living things or all the things that can experience pain and suffering, because of the vastly more suffering it will forestall. Not to do so would evince a selfish preference for the proximate, for preventing, that is, for preventing a smaller quantity of suffering over an unimaginably greater amount that is in the distant future. In other words, to be concerned about the here and now, the people, the things and people that are close to you in time and space and blood and whatever measure of affinity you want to use, versus those things that are further away, is a very selfish, immoral thing, according to very major moral theories, such as utilitarianism, such as Kantianism, because both of those major moral theories place impartiality at the top. They said, look, I cannot say my pain is more significant than yours and do so morally. I cannot say that my pain, my distress at having my life ended now is more important than all perhaps vast quantities of future beings who are going to suffer if people like me don't just vanish from the scene. So that's how you get to this thing called the benevolent, omnicidal, antinatalist robot. What, apart from the practicalities of this ever happening, but the idea is that all pain and suffering would be eliminated. And surely that sounds like a good thing, but doesn't sound like a good thing for us, because the suggestion is we are standing in the way of that possibility. And if we, what would be our argument for saying that would be wrong? The only kind of argument we could give is to say somehow we're special. The whole universe was about us. And if it doesn't serve our purposes, then it's bad. That flies in the face of impartiality, which is a very deeply held principle, even in the two major moral theories, both utilitarianism and Kantianism. So let me spell out some of the details, because there's some assumptions being made here. They need to be aired out, because if you don't like this conclusion, and I can imagine a lot of people wouldn't, we need to put our finger on what exactly is the mistake here. Is there some mistaken moral principle here that's in work that we need to spell out?
Well, yeah, it's called utilitarianism. This is the way it always works with utilitarianism.
You think that's it's a bad theory or something, or what?
Yeah, I don't know if Metzinger or whoever you're quoting now is the one who came up with that, but yeah, I mean, that's been around for a long time. You just trotted out.
Right. Well, he's not, by the way, suggesting we ought to, he's not promoting the idea. He's simply saying, what if? It's a thought, it's designed to provoke you to ask, what's wrong with this picture? Can you put your finger on what's wrong?
But what's wrong with it is the utilitarianism itself. So if you add something wrong to something that might be right, then obviously you're going to get something wrong.
Okay. Well, tell me what, I mean, utilitarianism is very widespread, a major moral theory. It's either, if it's not number one, it's number two in the world. As far as
it is. Whenever it gets to number one, we have terrible problems, because it justifies anything happening. I mean, it's opposed to Kantian dignitarianism, you might call it, right? Or
well,
and that's exactly it. When you don't have when the thing being sacred isn't held sacred above all, isn't human, well, then the humans are going to suffer.
Okay, well, actually, it's more subtle than that. There are actually different kinds of utilitarianism, at least three kinds. There's a whole bunch of kinds, but there's one way to divide them up that is relevant here. One is there's something called negative utilitarianism, there's positive utilitarian, and there's something that's sort of neutral or in the middle. The kind of utilitarianism that is in play in this little experiment is negative. It's this, and it appeals to a principle that is widely held. Maybe not everybody in the world places this principle very high, but it is institutionalized in a lot of culture. We'll give examples in a moment. And it's this basic idea. It's actually been sometimes called Benatar's asymmetry, because it was used to great effect by David Benatar, an antinatalist philosopher, in an argument he wrote, in a book he wrote, Better Never to Have Been, about 7 or 8 years ago. Basically, it says here, different ways of expressing it, but here I'm going to try to get it across. It is this: it is more wrong to bring about pain and suffering than it is to fail to bring about pleasure and happiness. In other words, and you can see this idea in a lot of folk morality. For example, when you hear people say, if you can't help, at least don't make matters worse. If you can't be part of the solution, don't be part of the problem. Or we should leave well enough alone. Or in medicine, there's something called the Hippocratic Oath that says, first do no harm. And in law, there's something called that an accused is innocent until proven guilty. All of these and many other things like them are undergirded by negative utilitarianism, because what they all have in common is this: these moral rules of thumbs, or heuristics, whatever you want to call them, they ask us to not take unwarranted risks that may bring about worse outcomes in order to promote the possibility of good ones. The good ones ought to be overwhelmingly probable in order to override this conservative principle. What are people afraid of? They're afraid that if you don't first tell doctors don't do harm, and then if you can, by all means help. But first, don't make the patient worse. Why? Because you may end up killing the patient well-meaningly, meaning you want to help them, but you're going to try out some drug that has not been properly tested. You end up killing them. Should doctors just reach for the nearest experimental drug in hopes that it will solve your problem? This is what the principle of first do no harm is supposed to prevent. Don't take chances when unless you have
Okay. But I mean, due to switching it around, so then I would say that is a dignitarianism, and it's got a little, around the edges. We can take advantage. So how to relate that to the problem that Metzinger put out, that where he thinks he's giving an exception?
Okay. Well, yeah, this is actually going to be a rather torturous explanation, but I'm going into the details of this. I'll come back to the Metzinger example, but this is underscoring that. Remember that commandment, that imperative that was programmed into this omnicidal, antinatalist, benevolent robot. It is to end suffering, period, and by whatever means necessary. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. It doesn't say promote joy and happiness, period, by whatever means necessary. It pedestalizes it, places on a higher level the ending of negatively valenced experiences. That is more important than promoting its opposite. That's negative utilitarianism. By the way, neutral utilitarianism is the kind that probably the more common kind that people are familiar with of J.S. Mill, which was their principle is that the right thing to do is always to minimize pain and suffering and or promote joy and happiness or pleasure and happiness. That version of utilitarianism is neutral because it doesn't say, well, when you can't do which one takes priority here? Should you be minimizing pain and suffering, or should you put most of your resources into promoting joy and happiness? It's kind of doesn't answer that question. That's why it's neutral. But negative utilitarian does answer that question. It says preventing the bad stuff is first priority always. Then, if you still have any resources left, worry about making things better. Whereas the reverse, by the way, is positive utilitarianism, which, as far as I know, is not strongly defended by too many people, but it's the reverse. We should all be putting all our resources into making everybody ecstatic all the time. And if you do that, you don't have to worry about the bad stuff or something like that. That would be positive utilitarianism. But negative utilitarianism has a very well, the difference is that negative utilitarianism resonates in a lot of cultural practices, as I'm trying to point out here. It comes up, for example, also in the law. Why don't we, and this is a very ancient principle, goes back to 1800 BC. It's found in the Code of Hammurabi way back in ancient times, but it's certainly still around in like say not everywhere, by the way, but in many familiar legal systems. And that's the idea that you're innocent until proven guilty. Why? Why not just assume you're guilty? If someone accuses you of a crime, why not just assume you're guilty and then make you prove that you're innocent? Why that the preference for assuming people are innocent until they're proven guilty? Why not reverse that? In fact, there are situations in the world where they do reverse it, but those are the exceptions. The fear is that you might accidentally make a perfectly innocent person, punish a perfectly innocent person if you go around assuming that they're guilty and then putting the burden on them to prove that they're innocent instead of the reverse, which is the common practice in our systems. Underneath that is fear of making that your first obligation is always to not do evil, and only secondarily to do good. That's negative utilitarianism in a nutshell. And this robot would be programmed for that. You might ask, well, but preventing future generations of people, wouldn't that rob the future a lot of joy and happiness and so forth? Yes, that's your to make conditions so that future people have wonderful experiences is a good thing. But is that your first obligation? Your first obligation, if you're a negative utilitarian, as this argument assumes, is to prevent the bad stuff first. It takes higher priority. And also Benatar says, look, if you don't exist, you can't very well miss out on the good stuff because you don't exist.
Okay. Actually, I mean, I can put that whole thing to rest. Actually, the very premise of the thought experiment violates human dignity.
Oh,
That basically,
okay.
no, I mean, no, you didn't interrupt Vincent at all. I mean, he went on for like 15 minutes. So do we have to subscribe to be a speaker here to like just
No, go ahead, Jeff. Go ahead.
So I mean, that's the thing, that the whole premise of that is that not a lot of people will like that. Not everybody is into freedom, right? They don't trust themselves with it, and that's understandable, because they haven't had practice, perhaps.
Right.
But that's the thing. So the whole premise there is got that. So it would be controversial even by the negative utilitarianism, as you're calling it, which is really a misnomer, I think.
Okay.
So I think it's over there. And the whole thing, I mean, it started off really well. I think it's been almost 2 hours.
Well, there's a lot more to this. Let me get to Jeff. Okay. First of all, you're right. There's definitely utilitarianism built into this, but there's more that isn't utilitarianism. And it's a specific kind of utilitarianism, negative utilitarianism. But that's just one of the 3 or 4 moral principles involved in this experiment. That's one of them. But the others are not utilitarian. By the way, but I do want to finish explaining why this at least has initial plausibility, whether you end up agreeing or not, why this principle that it's more wrong to bring about pain, suffering, than it is to fail to bring about pleasure and happiness. The idea is not that it's wrong to promote positive things, only that it is more wrong to bring about bad things. That's important to keep. It's just a difference of priorities. But we also see this in other places. And for example, we don't go around criminalizing people who fail to give to charity. We don't punish people who refuse to risk their lives to save others, although there are historical cases where we do, in fact, do these things, but it's not the norm. Whenever it does happen, it raises eyebrows. A good example of this is we don't put, when you walk by a homeless person and you don't give them a coin or two, we don't lock you up for that. On the other hand, if you walk by them and you kick them or assault them, we do. The implication, if you're not required to make other people better off, but you certainly are required not to make them worse off. Why that principle? It's true, there are certain political economic philosophies that might militate against that. For example, certain forms of Marxism or communitarianism, for example, would say, no, you are obligated, just as obligated to help to make people better off as you are not to make them worse off. But that isn't the dominant view in the cultures that we live in. But I'm not defending this, I'm just pointing out that these things are there. Another example would be a pregnant woman who chooses to abort over proceeding with a birthing that will risk her life. We don't criminalize her for making the choice to have an abortion in that situation. Of course, I know it is criminalized in some places, but we're talking about people who are generally think of themselves as liberal, open-minded, moral people who are not appealing to certain dogmas or religious dogmas that govern their behavior. We don't force women, on pain of imprisonment, that to risk their lives. That there are women who have risked their lives for the sake of a child. That's true. That's heroic, but it's not mandatory. Or a person who refuses to take arms to defend their country. Yeah, there used to be a draft, and you would be penalized if you did not go serve in the army. But by and large, at least that idea is not very popular in these days. We may make life uncomfortable for you if even during the draft, you may not be sent to prison, but you would suffer if you, in one way or another, if you refuse to serve your country called upon you to do this. And why is that? Again, it seems to be that we don't want to force people to do good, but we do want to contain their evil or bad angels, so to speak. So these are all examples of folk morality. Folk morality is like what people out there do who are not philosophers and not trying to be consistent. They're just living in society, doing what many of the people around them do or accept it without too much question. But underneath a lot of those folk moral rules of thumb, so to speak, there is usually a theory that would support that view. Okay, so again, to summarize this before I move on to the other one, by and large, we think the worse of people who deliberately, recklessly bring about pain and suffering, even though they and others may see themselves as do-gooders, than we do of billionaires who could relieve the suffering of hundreds of thousands at small cost to themselves, but don't. In other words, we haven't, I'm not aware that we are ready to imprison Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk for failing to give away their money. Maybe we should, but no one's seriously talking about it. But that's what negative utilitarianism would say. That's acceptable. It's not that they would be much better if they did do good with their money to help others, but to create moral and legal sanctions against them is beyond the pale, at least according to this principle. Okay. There's a lot more to be said about that, but I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because there's more than utilitarianism going on here. Okay, another moral principle that's embodied in that thought experiment about the benevolent, anti-natalist, what's the third thing? I keep forgetting the description. Oh, omnicidal, meaning kill everything alive that's around you, prevent it from reproducing, and do it for sympathetic moral motives, okay, because you're trying to relieve pain and suffering. Okay, the second principle that's involved in that is this: the elimination of pain and suffering to the fullest extent possible is a moral imperative. Now, almost all moral theories would agree with that, but especially utilitarianism. Utilitarianism places it on a pedestal. That's the number one principle. Other moral theories don't necessarily. They say it's a good thing to do this to eliminate pain and suffering, but there might be other things that take priority as well. But this is definitely a utilitarianism intuition here. So I'm not going to say more about that one. But this one, though, is not. And that the third one is this: we are under an obligation to improve on our failings. Morality is progressive. There is no such thing as a level of moral development with which we may rest content. In other words, this is a perfectionist principle, and it's undergirding a lot of varieties of virtue theory and Kantianism, because Kantianism is very perfectionist as well as the Aristotelian virtue theories. Basically, what this means is that there's never a point in which you can say this is enough. We've reached the pinnacle of being good enough. We don't have to strive for better. All these theories see it as a never-ending. The more successful we are at becoming more civilized, and decent as a society, the more we realize there's still so much more we have to do, and there isn't an end game to this. That's this principle here, and this is not utilitarianism at all. It's much more founded in Kantianism and even Aristotelian virtue theory, whose idea has nothing to do with the consequences or pain and suffering. It's about making the world better to whatever within our powers, and to increase our powers to be able to make the world even better still. And this is a never-ending process. That's not utilitarianism. It comes from somewhere else. But that's also behind this benevolent, omnicidal, anti-natalist robot, because this thing would not be satisfied with making the world a little better or a lot better, but assuming it was as capable. It's almost a bit like the conception of an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good God. If it had the knowledge of everything, then it would know how to make the world a good place. So it comes up in the problem of evil. And if it had, infinite capabilities and was infinitely benevolent, then why is there any evil in the world at all? That's a challenge to the problem of evil. But this suggests something similar, but this time it's an artificial being that has those qualities, is supremely good, supremely capable, and supremely intellectually equipped, intelligent enough to pull it off. Unlike us, we are none of those things. We are not infinitely smart, infinitely capable, and certainly not infinitely good. But this being would be. That's the ideal. And one of the consequences of it is that it would decide out of sympathy, with the idea that pain and suffering are bad things, that we need to go. that it would eliminate us, put us out of our misery, literally, all of us. Now, this sounds like a crazy idea, but in this case, it relies upon principles that are pretty widely held by many people. Not everyone. Okay, back to Jeff. You reject the utilitarian aspect. I'm not a utilitarian either. I don't think utilitarianism is the be-all, certainly not the be-all and end-all of moral theories. But that it is a very powerful and important one, and it does actually govern a lot of human institutions, is undeniable. And I don't see anything obviously wrong. Okay, the biggest problem with this thing, let's look at the ways out of this dilemma here. But you might not like those either. Okay, one way out of this, and this is something that Mike suggested early on. Well, why not, and that's this, why not just stipulate that non-biological entities, like such as the AGI, can never be objects of moral concern by defining sentience, normativity, that is placing value on things, or any kind of consciousness arising from these things? Why not just say that all these things are only occur in exclusive biological contexts, so that there could never be such a if there were ever an entity like this, we would have to see it as evil, because it would be an opponent of biology, and we are biological. It would be our enemy. We'd want to just prevent it from happening in the first place if we could. But if it did happen, we would want to destroy it, because it would be out to destroy us if we destroy it first. So that would be to be biologically chauvinistic and drop the impartiality of morality, which suggests that biology is not a condition for moral theory, that moral theory can extend beyond biological things. And some of the things we were talking about earlier, including Metzinger, conditions of suffering, suggest that we need to think more broadly about moral, where the realm of moral concern stops. Unless we have a clear understanding of why it stops there, then we're in danger of crossing the line and creating more suffering in the world by creating artificial forms of it, in addition to all the natural forms that are still there. That's one way out of this, but there are three problems with that way out, with the way that would confine moral relevance or moral concern and moral agency to only biological things. Here are three problems with this. The idea there would be to treat any kind of intelligence like that, to keep it always at the moral status of an eating utensil. Computers, no matter how smart, will never have more moral status than a spoon or a fork. They're a tool to serve us and no other purpose. So we shouldn't be talking about morality in these things. That's one way out of this. But there are some problems with that. First is mere utensils have been used by us to kill ourselves, no matter their moral status. Electricity, chairs, ropes, sharp objects, toxic and explosive chemicals are and have been quite useful to our survival. Metzinger's benevolent, omnicidal, antinatalist robot, if you call it utensil if you like, would still serve our better angels. That is, the parts of ourselves that we think are the good parts, not all the evil that human beings are capable of, but sometimes we do some nice things. And then wouldn't it be better if those nice parts of us were preserved, but the bad stuff was exterminated? Well, it could be that the really good part of us would be for us to accept that maybe the world would be a better place without us in it. If we could bring ourselves to believe that, that might actually be what should happen. Recall, the values this thing would execute will have originated with us. And to the extent we identify with those better angels, we may wish it luck, because surely we think the world is a better place with less pain and suffering. What's the problem if it also means that we have to go? Remember, it's not about torturing us, it's about euthanizing us. So yes, our future expectations would be thwarted, but that's a small price to pay given how the vast amount of suffering that is in store for beings that aren't even born yet. That's the antinatalist view. And another problem is this, and this ties in with what we were talking about earlier with Kate Darling and stuff. But second, if only it were true that non-living things or inanimate objects were never objects of moral concern, but they are and they have been. Consider the fierce debates in environmental ethics as to whether we only care about the environment because of its effects on the quality of life we expect and want our descendants to have. This is an anthropocentric argument. It's selfishness writ large. In other words, it's like, I don't care about anything beyond what's important to me. Well, as a species, we're saying we don't care about anything except what's important to our kind. The rest of the universe can go to hell. Or that's one view for caring about the environment, not because we care about the environment, but because we care about that it's going to hurt us and our kind if we don't, where we be soiling our own nest, so to speak. But there's a whole different way of looking at environmental ethics that is competing with that one. And this is the view that says that no, environmental ethics the environment has value in and of itself, whether or not we are around to enjoy it. These people believe that there are landscapes, ecosystems, sunsets, mountains, rocks, even lifeless planets that are beautiful and worthy of care and moral regard, no matter whether we or anything like us is ever going to appreciate them. Some people think it is good that, as yet, there are no McDonald's burger wrappers on the moon. Was the Earth worthless before we came along? Millions of years of evolution were they significant only because they led to us? Was all creation of value only because we appeared? Yeah, there are biblical pronouncements to the contrary. Many can imagine that there are objects of moral concern that we ought to tread, and that we ought to tread lightly, and not just because it may matter to us or to whatever results from the survival of our kind. This is a view that says we ought to have moral regard for inanimate objects, whole systems that have nothing to do with us or anything related to us, simply because they're valuable in and of themselves. This idea comes up in aesthetics too, like is art valuable in and of itself, or is it valuable only because of what it does for us? Art for art's sake, so to speak. Finally, and this is something we talked about earlier, whether or not any entity has any value, or doesn't have any value, apart from its service to our interests, is not entirely a function of any objective property it may have. Beings like us confer value on things that are not and never have been alive, and not just because of their usefulness to us. Imagine you can find YouTube videos on this. Imagine barbecuing a teddy bear, or drowning a Barbie doll, or watching a hot wired old clothes dryer rip itself to pieces, trying to dry a piece of iron in someone's backyard for the amusement of YouTube viewers. Psychologically, we evolved to have our feelings triggered by the apparent suffering of anything, dead or alive, that even remotely resembles something we associate with suffering. It doesn't even have to look or behave much like us. It's enough if it does one of those things in some context. AGI robots will pull our heartstrings, if we have any, the more capable they become of constructively interacting with us. So, okay, I'm sorry, I've been lecturing here a lot, but I want to pause here. Anybody have any? This is a very complex argument when you unfold it, but it does strike me that it has some plausibility. There are ways around it, but you pay a price for them. I think you have a challenge to meet the objections if you decide to reject this argument. Anyway, so anybody have any?
Can I make a comment?
Yeah.
So you may have covered this. I apologize if you did, but okay. So suppose one day the machine decides to get rid of everybody. I mean, or get rid of future people, or some variation of that.
Yeah.
That announcement alone would cause an incredible amount of suffering.
Yeah.
So the machine actually is not doing what it was intending to do. It's causing In fact, what kind of suffering could exceed the announcement to the whole human race that they're through? I mean,
Yeah.
there isn't one. So the machine is automatically defective.
Yeah.
Secondly, a machine like that, and this is the argument I made at the meetup, to me, has a profound lack of common sense, and that it's not factoring in the, well, according to, depending upon which theory it adopts, and maybe it could come to a conclusion. But I think if you were to put the question to the whole human race, not just to one person, to the whole human race, ask the whole human race, do you just want to stop? The answer is going to be a no. We're not going to stop. We're going to keep going. We don't care what the arguments are. We want to spend our Sundays watching football, not engaging in these conversations. So I don't think that that robot would harmonize with human thinking, common sense. So those two, I get those two counter arguments.
No, okay. Thanks a lot, Mike. And those are important. Yeah, those come up. I'm sure that's a natural reaction of most people to this. And so here's the response to the first one is that euthanizing everything that's alive on the planet right now, even if in order to maximize or minimize or eliminate pain and suffering as a method for doing that, would surely cause vast amounts of pain and suffering itself. So it sounds contradictory. But here's the response, and I did read it. It is rationally and morally justifiable to do this, to eliminate all living things right now, because of the vastly more suffering it will forestall. In other words, human beings have done this before, where they have sacrificed some people or one person to save many. And that's a utilitarian thought. But the scale here, what happens if we don't? If we don't euthanize? What's going to happen is there will be many, who knows how many, much more suffering there will be in the future that will be forestalled. And the sheer quantity of that outweighs all the suffering that would be, the frustration is a better way to put it, because we're talking about not, we're talking about euthanizing, that is painlessly as much as possible, putting people to death now. They would suffer, of course, because we have we've got future projects of stuff we want to do before we die a natural death, and that would be taken away from us. Our future lives that we want to experience, we wouldn't have. So that would be taken away from us, and that would cause suffering for sure. But the idea is that sure, that's going to happen, but not to have present real suffering of living people right now take preference over future suffering that's vastly, perhaps infinitely greater, is open selfishness, is saying that we are more important than all the future. And maybe we are, but from our own perspective, but morality, or at least one principle, that impartial principle of morality, says that as long as you're making if you're going to make a distinction and say that you or your friends or your family or all those creatures that are like you, they're more important than all of the non-existing as yet beings, then the quality of their life is going to be like, if you're more important than they are, that's not moral. Because you can use that kind of argument to say, no, to a reductio ad absurdum of that is to say, well, forget morality. It's all about me, period. It's about maximizing my happiness, my desire, and anybody else gets into the picture only because they are related to my happiness and joy and happiness. And if they aren't, or if I don't feel a close enough connection to them, then they're dispensable. Because non-existent future people don't exist, their temptation is to just say they don't matter. And remember, this is a machine. It doesn't have attachments to us in particular. Its principle is eliminate pain and suffering. And it means quantity of it. If it's a choice between eliminating a little or a lot, it will always choose to eliminate a lot. If it can eliminate all, that would be better still. So it's a response. It would simply weigh the pain and suffering. It would say that there's more pain and suffering that would be relieved by putting us out of our misery now than if it doesn't. That's response to the first one. The second one, though, the common sense one, is actually, I don't know if we have time to, I can go on if you guys want to continue with this, because there is an answer to that one. And that's simply to say that whatever you mean by common sense, it's not rational. And this one assumption of this thing is that it was rational. And this raises a question that somebody asked early on, and she's not here anymore, Ruth, and it has to do with what is the relationship between intelligence and being rational? Is it possible to be intelligent but not rational? And the answer is, yeah, it must be, because that's what we are. So that you could say that maybe if you redefine, if you're very specific what you mean by artificial intelligence, the intelligence part, if you don't mean to imply that to be intelligent is to be rational, but what you really mean to imply is to be intelligent is to be like us, then that changes the game entirely. Because now we're not talking about entities that are perfectly better than us. They're going to be just as good or just as bad as us. They're just going to be more like us. So then at that point, we're no longer talking about a being that's more of anything. It's just a copy of us, with all the good things and the bad things as well. That's common sense. Common sense is the way most people think. They don't necessarily, if some purely rational philosopher, a philosopher comes up with this experiment that leads to this absurd conclusion that is absurd from a normal common sense point of view, they immediately reject it and say there's an error with that argument. There may not be an error in the reasoning of the argument, unless you can pinpoint and say one of the premises is simply not true, or they are true, but the reasoning is mistaken. In this case, it's not obvious that any of those two things are correct. You can reject an argument because the conclusion is just too absurd, and then you simply accept it as being a paradox, a problem. If there are paradoxes in mathematics, that logical paradoxes for which we can't accept the conclusion, but there's no obvious not obvious that there's anything wrong with the argument itself. And that's what makes this an interesting philosophical thought experiment, because I don't see an obvious response to it that is still philosophical. There's a common sense rejection of it. That's why it's interesting. Why it's even worth paying attention to, because it does contradict common sense. And if we want to be rational and have common sense too at the same, it's like having your cake and eating it too. It may not be possible. It may be that, and this raises the possibility that intelligence does not automatically imply rationality if we define it that way, if we're willing to do that, in which case we'll be saying that we, existing human beings, are the paradigm of what intelligence is. So if a robot does something better, more rational than us, then it's not intelligent. No matter, it may be rational, but it's not intelligent, because to be intelligent is to be like us, and we are not rational. That would be one way out of this. I'm sorry, anybody else want to respond to that? So that's one of the final questions I ask at the end is, well, does intelligence, the I in AI, imply rationality? If you're willing to drop that consequence, then you can avoid this problem. Simply say that anything that violates common sense can't possibly be intelligent. That's the way you get out of it. I don't know. So
Victor, add one thing. I can't remember if this is from the Suffering article by Metzinger, or it was another one. But it might have just been specifically about his argument for the moratorium of, I can't remember, all AI research of that kind, or AI research.
Right. He's one of the people who signed this moratorium that we should stop AI research for. He wants to stop it for 50 years, but other people are saying 6 months, because he thinks we're afraid we're going to create something we're not going to know how to handle.
It's no wonder he wants to stop it.
Yeah.
And it helps me with this thought experiment, because I remember him saying, which is great, he talks about the epistemic uncertainty that we have toward not only a theory of morality, but a theory of consciousness, and that's why he's so open to kinds of research programs that will help understand and uncover the relationship between consciousness and morality and suffering, etc. But going back to that epistemic uncertainty, again, if the thought experiment is about, all you have to do is, as you say, accept that there is an openness to understanding what is the relationship between intelligence, rationality, and that there is a circular issue with us just assuming that rationality is a model by which humans are the model of that, and that there is a non-zero chance that, according to, at least as you were arguing, there's a historical and consistent, if we were measuring rationality with some form of at least consistency in the logic, etc. If there is a non-zero chance that this kind of intelligence, consciousness, AI could emerge, that would then either be programmed by humans or self-evolve into that rational conclusion of suicidal neonatalism or whatever it was called. Then that is all you need as an argument in order to at least get to the moratorium, right? Because that's all you have to say is, like, I don't have to agree with negative utilitarianism per se, but all I have to do is, as I think you've been demonstrating, that there's a non-zero possibility that there could be a consistent form of negative utilitarianism that would emerge and somewhat be programmed into an AI or naturally evolve through the AI after it has already been built and coded by humans, that could emerge a kind of AI ethics that would lead to this, obviously, at least to humans right now, an unwanted outcome.
Right.
Therefore, there's at least a possibility, or at least an argument to be made, that humans right now have the moral obligation to suspend the kind of research in order to prevent that from happening.
Right,
and
right.
That's all. It seems like that's all he's kind of arguing. Yeah, you don't have to accept utilitarianism. You don't have to accept that actually it is possible that AI could be conscious or not. Right. I think he says in that article that it's not a yes or no binary. Right. Some people already argue that's like, nope. If it doesn't have a biological substrate, it can't be conscious. And then there are others who already argue that, like, nope, it's 100% possible that any substrate with the right organization, et cetera, could emerge some form of consciousness. It may not look exactly like human consciousness. Yeah, so that kind of thing. And he's kind of saying there's an epistemic uncertainty. It may be true that actually it's not possible that consciousness could emerge in that way.
Yeah.
But it's uncertain, right? That it is false. So therefore, non-zero chance, epistemic uncertainty. This thought experiment is consistent. Therefore, moratorium is morally obligated.
Right. Thanks a lot, Vincent. That may help make clear the connection between this and what his point is. It isn't that he's certainly promoting that we do this. Quite the opposite. He's concerned the mere possibility of this. It's not obviously crazy from a purely logical point of view. This could happen. It's a practical matter, is a whole other story. But the fact that AI research might facilitate this possibility is cause for having a moratorium and stopping and getting clear of exactly what we're doing and what we mean by intelligence and what's the point of what we're doing. We need to talk about this, is what his whole point was.
You make that argument about, it's kind of similar to the arguments of like climate change, right?
Yeah.
Arguments like, even if people, it's not caused by humans, et cetera, and you're like, if there's a non-zero chance that it was caused by humans, at least a little bit, then we have a moral obligation to, and then make your argument X, Y, Z, right?
Yeah.
Right.
That's right. I think that's the core of what he's trying to do. Although I think he does express in various places, he does have sympathy with the antinatalist and the Benatarian assumption of negative utilitarianism, and it actually fits with his Buddhist understandings background as well. But yeah, I mean, his point is we need to pause for thought here, because when it was not even conceivable that we would ever be coming close to making something like such a powerful entity that was vastly more capable, more intelligent, and more benevolent than us, this was an idle thought. But the fact that some people, anyway, are talking like it's not totally out of the realm of possibility, that even if we just get some kind of artificial entity that's a little bit better than we are in terms of morally, its behavior, a bit more intelligent and more capable, well, that's a slippery slope. Once you do that, what's to stop you from getting a lot more of those things? You know, and are we approaching, and of course, as many people will remind us, we're nowhere near even getting and of course, it has a lot to do with how we define intelligence too. Are we using ourselves as the standard of what is intelligent, or do we have in mind some ideal, super hyper rational entity or something? That's the kind of threat he was talking about. If it's just a super capable, super intelligent, but I'm sorry, just moderately, or just like us, basically, or maybe a little better than us, maybe we don't have anything to worry about. But if we can get that far, what's to prevent us from getting much further? It seems to me. I think that was his worry. Anyway, does anybody else want to say anything? Those people who are still here.
It's a good argument. I mean, an interesting one. I'm not convinced of it, but I think it's interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's not really supposed to convince you that it's likely to happen. But as Vincent was saying, it seems like there's a non-zero chance. You can't say that there's no possibility it's violating some logical law or something. You know, like one of these days we'll, know how to square a circle or something. It's not quite that crazy. But anyway, that's. But I think its value as a thought experiment is because it does raise these other questions. Like, for example, when we talk about intelligence, does that supposed to imply being rational? Is it identical with being rational? Can you be intelligent and irrational? It seems to me that it is possible, unless we humans are not intelligent. What we are is sometimes we act rationally and sometimes we don't. Maybe much of the time we don't. But if we're going to create artificial beings like us who are sometimes reliable and sometimes not, it's, imagine a spell checker that sometimes said the words that were perfectly correctly spelled were wrong just on a whim. How useful would that be? In a way, that's us. Maybe we get our spelling better more than 50% of the time, but still, we can at least envision a artificial intelligence that doesn't get it wrong anywhere near as much as we do. Anyway, I'm sorry.
What I like about Metzinger, especially his overall research program, is pretty cool that he is kind of grounding what kind of seemingly is like a traditional phenomenological research program with empirically based and evolutionary based. And that's kind of as you talked about, what he talked about, that kind of that blind spot that he's trying to look for, where it seems like the more positivist, biologically bent people of consciousness are more like Daniel Dennett, who just wants to eliminate some of the more phenomenal qualities. Of course, then the opposite direction, Chalmers, who then kind of wants to almost say that you can't really study it biologically because there are perhaps panpsychic laws that govern consciousness, etc. With possible design. So it's pretty cool. He's kind of doing a little bit of both, or at least kind of finding that little that lane in between them, right? Right.
Yeah, he wants to. That's why he was trying to spell out what are the conditions of suffering. He wants to say, okay, we need to spell what we mean by suffering. What are the empirically measurable criteria? The stuff that science and psychology and all our psychological methods we've developed for studying human behavior or any kind of rational behavior, we have tools for learning about things. We're making progress in that direction. We need to domesticate vague concepts like suffering and consciousness, define them in terms that we can then measure and study. So that they require like specifying, what do you mean by that? So that we can then see what can be measured, what can be observed, and learned empirically about these things. So yeah, but he doesn't dismiss the phenomenology. In fact, it's very strongly coming, it seems like, from that tradition. Yeah, he's trying to combine modern, find a phenomenological foundation for a new kind of science in a way. But it's still science in the sense that we want to be able to do the kind of objective analysis and data collection that is done in traditional science to be able to tell what is suffering, what is consciousness. If they're just vague notions that different people have different ideas of what they are, you're never going to make any progress that way. We need to settle minimal criteria for what consciousness and suffering, which is one way to measure consciousness according to him, what they are. And that's what one of the things he tries to do. Okay, any final comments? If not, those of you who are still here, again, thanks a whole lot for hanging out on this. And I'll be posting the next topic in a few days. It'll be slightly related to this one. It's going to be on Tamar Gendler's notion of an A-leaf. An A-leaf is like a B leaf, but it's got strong affective component to it that will override B leaves we have to such an extreme, sometimes that it can literally force us to do things against our settled beliefs. And it's not because it's unconscious, but because it can be perfectly conscious and yet simply override. Anyway, it's an interesting idea or phenomenon that she's given a name to, and has studied and generated a lot of controversy in philosophy. But we'll be talking about that next time. Okay. So anyway, for those of you still here, thanks and bye. Right.